also on the Populi. So you can always find what we study in class, what we discuss in class. If in case somebody missed it, I always try to put that in Populi. So if you had a bad connection or dropped out or something like that, you can always go back and review our meetings and get a recording of this very lecture and this very discussion. All right, so just keep in mind that you have that. Now, all right, so chapter 4 is where we are. Worldview, cultural explanations of life and death. It's really funny. I mean, I find it a funny title because the authors of the textbook kind of focus on life and death, but it actually is a very appropriate focus. Why? Because that is one thing that most cultures have very peculiar views about, and that's what sets us apart. And it's usually tied to our worldview. Whatever we think about life and wherever we think about death often frames our perspective on everything else. Okay, it kind of tells people so much about what the rest of their philosophy of life is, how do they feel about everything in this world, sort of say. Like if I get somebody to present their views of life and death to me in a very nice, well articulated, kind of succinct way, then I get a window into who they really are and what they truly think and believe. Like it gives me a really broad picture, of that. And this is why the authors are focusing on, life and death, things like that, because that tells you so much about how a person sees themselves in this world and, what they think, is really life is all about, sort of say. Okay. And that worldview, that perspective informs people in everything they do. Okay, that's the important part. And communication is something we do all the time. And communication is directly affected by these types of things. Okay, so that's really what it's about. Okay, so we're beginning on page 103 in chapter 4. And the authors are stating a couple of really interesting things that I wanted for us to focus right now. First of all, they have a very simple definition of worldview, and this is something I definitely want you to know. They write that worldview is the way people interpret reality and events, including how they see themselves in relation to the world around them. Now, that's a very simple definition. There are more complicated definitions of worldview out there. But this very simple definition, I think, will do for us. I think it will work for us. Think of it. Worldview is the way people interpret reality and events. Okay? It's all about seeing what is real, what is happening. Okay? And you interpret. Something terrible happens, an earthquake, a tsunami, whatever, a death in a family, a sickness, and you interpret that through your worldview. You don't just say, okay, why did this happen? Why did I get sick? Or why did, this happen? Why did this earthquake, destroy this city? And you have an answer, but your answer is usually flowing from your worldview. Okay, whatever that worldview may be. It could be an atheist worldview, or it could be a theist worldview. And then you interpret reality that is around you. You interpret events that are around you through it, including how you see them, how you see yourself in relation to the world. You see yourself, in society, in this world, for some reason or purpose, or for no reason or purpose, depending on what your worldview is. If various worldviews would interpret themselves existing in this world and playing a role in this world purely based on what it is that they believe about this world and how this world came to be, sort of say. And the big picture, how do you fit into the big picture is going to be very different. And so this is a really good definition of worldview. It's simple, but it will work. And so they also write that the picture of reality is both created and shaped by the members of each culture. So as we interpret the world around us, call that the reality. Okay, the world around is the reality. That's really what's going on. It is our culture that is creating it and altering it and shaping it. Our culture essentially dictates to us how to understand what's happening. Okay, so I'll give you an example. When a huge flood came to New Orleans, New Orleans is, it's a big city on the south, on the Gulf coast of Mexico. Mexico, it's in the south of the United States. When the whole entire city was just flooded by hurricane, hurricane just completely devastated it. Some people, lamented this event and blamed the weather, and other people said, "Oh, it's us. We're human beings. We messed up this world. We got global warming going on. These tsunamis are now, these hurricanes come in and they wipe us out because this is Earth fighting back for us messing with, nature too much. We have polluted it to the degree that it's trying to kick us out," so to say. Other people said, "Oh, no, this is the punishment from God because New Orleans is such a godless city. It is a city of sin and just, and this is God punishing them." So every single person looked at that event and their worldview told them how to understand the flooding and the hurricane that hit the city. The devastation was huge. Everybody in the country was affected because we had people basically had to leave the city and find shelter somewhere else because it was unlivable. So a lot of the states in the United States, especially in the southern portion of the United States, have received refugees from there. And almost every state, including the federal government, has sent aid to the city of New Orleans. And they're still rebuilding. They still have not rebuilt. Many years have passed and they still have not rebuilt from that. But everybody looked at that event and everybody had something to say about it. They had an opinion. Well, their opinion was based on their understanding of reality, okay? Their view of the world. And so you would see that how differently people interpreted what happened. And it was 100% dictated by their worldview. So another statement right here on page 103 that the authors state that's really important to understand. They write that the members of the same society make use of shared assumptions about how the world works. As they interpret everyday experiences in light of these assumptions, they make sense of their lives, and their lives make sense to other members of the society. So essentially, what the authors are saying is that our worldview helps us make sense of life. It allows us to interpret it, give it meaning, give it reason, give it purpose. And as we look at the lives of other people, our worldview allows us to see meaning in their lives or events that happen around us. This is the function of a worldview. And so these definitions that we're talking about are really, really helpful in understanding. Now, religions are worldviews, actually. When we talk about religions and people's faiths, religion fits into that category very well because it is a way of seeing the world. It is a way of interpreting the world, and all events and everything that happens in it. Okay, and that means how you see that things that happen to you. Oh, this happened to me because, I hear Christians talk all the time to each other and they say, God blessed me. I had a friend just call me recently and he's moving from one state to another and his wife just got a job and she was able to transfer her job. And he says, you know what? I'm moving from New York and, the life in New York is much more expensive. So my wife was making, decent salary. And now we're moving to Atlanta and the the cost of living is way less in Atlanta. And she said, and he says basically, well, guess what? I thought that my salary is going to be reduced, right? Well, he says, no, they actually gave me more money. And so, and he says, God blessed me. He does not see the increase in salary as a result of, oh, I got better, I have better training, my education level grew, or whatever, my experience level grew, or my expertise are more valued in this particular, locality or something like that. My experience is more, valuable. His worldview is, God gave this to me. This is a gift from God. This is grace. This is just something that God wanted me to have. So that's it. I have it. He didn't see it this like as I earned this or anything like that. So because his perspective of life is these things are not guaranteed, they're not controlled by us, we can't really manipulate it. It's just, he says this is a favor from God. So that's his worldview. So you see a simple person moving from city to city and getting a raise while they're actually expecting a decrease in salary. His worldview says, no, this is God. And so another person would have looked at the same exact situation and might have come up with a different way of explaining why this is happening, in this particular moment, in life. So that's worldviews. That's what happens. And that's why what person believes about the world helps them to interpret what happens to them and to other people all around them. And that's why it's important, because in the end, it affects how we see the world, and how we see the world is how we communicate. What we say is a complete outflow of how we think. And how we think is defined by worldview and culture. So you could see why studying these things all of a sudden gives us an insight into how people think. And it helps us to understand people better, because now we can unravel that complicated structure of their thought, because it's not always easy to realize how other people think. We may do okay with how we think, but how do other people think? And that's much more complicated, and that's requires, some mastery. So on page 104, the authors highlight the types of questions that the worldview usually answers. Okay, and this is a really good list of questions. I want you to think about these questions yourself. Can you answer those questions in your own worldview? I guarantee you that these answers that you will give to those questions will be probably different just between all of us sitting here right now. How you would answer them, not the words you choose, but just the worldview that you embrace will dictate your answers, okay? That's what I'm trying to say. And they will be a little bit different, and so look at this. What is the purpose of life? Can you answer that question? For yourself. Can you? How you're going to answer that question will tell me what you actually believe. It will help me understand your worldview. How does law, chance, or God rule the world? Things happen in the world by chance? Do they happen because God wanted it? Or is it just some natural law or some other law that's controlling it? Who's making things happen, basically in this world? All right. What is the right way to live? For some people, is there a right way to live? Is there a wrong way to live? Is anything in this world is right or wrong? But if you answer that question to me, that will tell me what your worldview is, what your value system is right away. What are the origins of the universe, and how did life begin? Can you answer that question for me? Now, if you answer that question for me, I will most likely be able to peg, at least partially, your worldview. And from that answer alone, I would be able to guess some of the other answers. You see what I mean? How about this one? What happens when we die? Can you answer that question? I bet some of you have thought about it. And if you haven't thought about it, I'm sure your culture has taught you about that. Your family has taught you about that. I'm sure you've been to a funeral or at least seen one on TV. I don't know. But the point is how, how people understand that will frame their belief system, their understanding of the world, and therefore will frame their behavior and their communication. So what are the sources of knowledge? How do you know things? What is good and bad and right and wrong? How do you define those things? Like if you tell your kids, oh, no, no, don't do this. This is bad. Well, where are you getting that from? Did you just make that up, or did you get that from somewhere? Well, most of us get it from culture, right? Most of us get it from culture. What is right? What is wrong? What is good? What is bad? What is human nature? What do you think about human beings? Are we good? Are we bad? Are we in the middle? These kinds of things. Why do we exist? Just to die? That was a big philosophical question that I struggled in my own youth. Being surrounded by I told you my background is like I was born and raised in a communist country, and I was taught Darwinism and things like that in school from the young age. And so being raised in a socialist, atheistic culture myself, I had to face the question, what's the point of life? If all we do is just born, live, and die, and there's nothingness, then why not just die now? Why struggle? Can you just end this now? Because there is no purpose. There is no future. There is no anything good coming to me. So why struggle? Why fight? And so that's a big question for me in my youth personally that I had to wrestle with. And so here I am, doing what I do. Now you understand it's a little bit of my journey of, not being raised in a religious environment, but really choosing an entirely different path from everyone else around me. So how do we determine truth? Who knows, who can answer that question? How do we know what is true, and how do we know what is not true? Is there such thing as an objective truth? Is there such thing as an absolute truth? Is truth absolute, or is all truth relative? How you answer that question will help me see your worldview and how you think. And I could probably predict some of the decisions and life choices that you will make based on the answers to these very questions right here. So what is our responsibility to other people? Are we responsible for other people at all? Does it matter? Do other people even matter to us? And if they do, how much? To what degree? See, that will tell me much about your worldview. And pretty much all worldviews, whichever worldview we may pick, they deal with these questions. Some better, some not as good, some go deeper, some go shallower, but they all try to essentially answer these questions. And they all have sometimes 2 or 3 answers to those questions, but those answers do give you an idea of where a person comes from. And so answering these questions in a certain way will impact your social, your economic life, the educational system in which you participate in. It will, and from this, I could see how well you will function in a society that's competitive versus a society that's not competitive. Your work ethic will come from these very answers. Okay, whether you're apt to take risks or not will come from these very answers right here. I will know this right away. If you end, what your relationship, how you understand relationships between humans, whether you are going to be an innovator or not in your life, how do you view authority, and whether you have high regard or low regard for authority in your life. I will be able to know all these areas of your life from you simply answering these worldview questions. Okay. And that's important because once we get a clue of what worldview a person embraces, we would kind of see how their life would flow into a particular channel, and therefore their actions, their beliefs, and the way they communicate, or why they say what they say, or why they don't say, what they don't say, is going to be now an explanation for it. Now there's a foundation upon which all these communicative behaviors are built. Okay. So that's why we study worldviews in communication. That's one of the reasons. All right. So there's a direct impact on all these areas of life, and all these areas of life are basically interconnected with how we communicate, because our communication touches every aspect of our life. All right. Here's a good thought at the very bottom of paragraph on page 104 that I thought was really helpful. The authors write here, the worldview of culture functions to make sense of life experiences that might otherwise be construed as chaotic, random, and meaningless. When we look at life without a worldview, just without any kind of system of explaining it, our life can seem random, chaotic, and meaningless. But once our worldview starts to inform us, it gives meaning. It explains why things happen the way they do. There's a reason, there's a purpose, there's a pattern. It's not random. This is not chaos. This is not just all happening by chance. There is a purpose, greater purpose behind it. That's what culture does. That's what a worldview does. It helps us to see life not as chaos, but as some sort of an organization. And it's easier for us, for humans, to make sense of it that way, because chaos is very uncomfortable for us to think. We can't fully embrace it. We're not capable, because chaos has way too many variables. We don't know where to go, essentially, in life with chaos. So we can't just have randomness and chaos, because that's very difficult to navigate in life. So what do you guys think? Is this good? Is this helpful? Anybody wants to jump in on a discussion? Let me know. All right, everyone's being quiet today. That's all right. So moving along, we have manifestations of the worldview section next. What else I wanted to highlight here? I think there's a couple of really good thoughts over here that I want you to hang on to. This is the big picture, okay? And this is something that I want you to be aware of. In this section, the authors highlight that the West emphasizes control of nature and the East emphasizes harmony with nature. This is very true, okay? And this is something that you should keep in mind. Essentially, a lot of times, it is kind of a standard practice to divide the world between East and West. Not because that's all it is, but because those are the predominant ways of thinking, okay? And predominantly, the West wants to control nature, and predominantly the Eastern type thinking wants to harmonize with nature. And that will actually impact so many things that people do. It will impact how they build houses. It will impact how they will, treat the environment, essentially, okay? It will impact their lives in a major ways. So is it about controlling nature, or is it about harmonizing with nature? So, okay, you guys live in Atlanta, so you probably have seen this a million times. When they build a new neighborhood, What do? They come in, they bring bulldozers, they flatten out everything completely flat. Then they build the houses, lay the sod, and plant the trees. Now, why didn't they just save the trees that were there before? Because it's not uniform. They wanted to look a certain way. So what did they do? They reshaped nature. They flattened it out. A lot of neighborhoods now build what they call retention ponds or drainage pools because the water has to drain somewhere. For thousands of years, that land formed itself so that the draining can occur naturally. And if we followed with the natural contour of the land and build our houses around how the water flows naturally, it would have been just fine, right? But no, because we reshaped that land to maximize our lot sizes or whatever, we ended up reshaping everything. And now we have to deal with the water drainage issues, and we don't know how. So we build a pool, essentially, that catches all the excess water and allows it to escape. Because we reshape the land in such a radical way when we do construction, we have to basically do it this way. I mean, that's the only way it will work practically. So you could see that in simple things like that, that in America, in the West, when people build a new neighborhood, they don't preserve old trees, they don't preserve existing land contours, they completely reshape it. Well, that is a value, that is a belief, and the belief is that we can control nature. We are the masters. We can do whatever we want. We can make it better for the way it works for us. Well, if Americans were more a line of Eastern thinking, they would have never done that. They would have built on the land the way it is. Instead of cutting that mountain down and flattening it, they would have left it. Instead of basically raising up that valley, they would have, and filling it up with dirt, they would have let it be. And they would have used the land the way it was. Why? Because they want to harmonize with it. They want to work with its natural flow rather than altering it. And that shows an attitude that we are not the masters of nature. We're not trying to change it or alter it to fit our needs. We're working with it. So things like that. Little things in life, but they actually end up impacting on how we treat the world around us. But if that's the attitude you have, if that's the belief you have, then it's going to overflow in other areas of life as well. Okay. That's going to overflow into, whether you recycle or not, or things like that as well. Everything. So another important thought that the authors talk about here, and this is important because we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, is in the Western world, the thinking, the logic moves from specific to the general. In the West, people break things down to the little denominators. Okay, small things. The world is broken up into small things, which all make up a bigger world. So the way the Westerners think is that the world consists of small things, and those small things are interrelated, but we can make sense of those small things and control those small things, and by doing that, we actually manipulate the whole world around us. All right, and so you always move from specific to the general. From something small to something larger. Well, the Eastern mindset is completely the opposite. In the Eastern mindset, you move from something general. The world is a big thing, a big, huge, cohesive system that all works together that we don't understand. And all we understand are the small things around us. So you move from the general to the specific. Well, that is a very different way of thinking about everything in life. And therefore, this is how people will live and communicate, because they do not focus on little things, thinking, okay, I'll rearrange these chess pieces on the board and everything's going to change. They're like, no. These chess pieces on the board are only a piece of a much bigger game that's going on in life, so to say. And all of a sudden, they're like, okay, that doesn't work. So, you can see how this will force people into an entirely different way of thinking, and therefore adopting a very different attitude in life, and therefore acting in very different ways. All right, so these are some general overview, kind of overarching issues of culture, okay, that we need to know. There is a fundamental difference between Western thinking and Eastern thinking, and I know that we're being tentative about this, but I just simply want you to know that this is a very traditional way of looking at these very stark contrasts in the way of how people think. All right. So let's move to the next section that talks about the constructs of the worldviews that we have. The authors present us with three specific constructs: atheism, spirituality, and long-established religious traditions. Now, some of you may question the number two, thinking, why isn't two and three connected? Well, in a way they are, in a way they're not, okay? And I'll explain that in a minute. But there's these three major constructs, essentially. Basically, when it comes to religious beliefs, or when it comes to worldviews, all worldviews can fit into these three categories that we see, okay? You have atheism as a category, you have spirituality as a category, and then you have long established religious traditions as a third category. And usually one of those religious worldviews, will, whatever it may be, it will fit into one of those categories. And then within those categories, of course, there's more classifications as well. But there we go. So I am on page 106, if you're following along with me, in chapter 4, looking at atheism as a worldview. Let's talk about atheism. Atheism is a very interesting system, and it's difficult to define, but it is called a worldview in which man is the measure. Man, human being, humankind. Whether it's one man or people in general, doesn't really matter, because we're talking about humans being the measure of all things. Humans decide what's right and wrong. Humans are the point of life. The point of life is all about you, not somebody else per se, or maybe somebody else but you, but it's all about people. People are the focus and the center of all things. Okay, so that is a worldview. And that is essentially a humanistic, worldview. We call it humanism, but we also call that atheism. Atheism is humanistic by definition. Okay, so maybe you have run into this perspective. How many of you have had, sort of say, experiences with atheism? Maybe you grew up an atheist. Maybe you've been surrounded by atheists. Maybe you still are an atheist. I don't know. You tell me. How many of you have experience with atheism? Anybody wants to share anything with me? Anyone? Okay, I told you guys that, I have extensive, sort of say, connection with atheism, because of that, how I grew up, just being connected to people who are largely atheists, living in a largely, atheist society. So for me, atheism is, I understand it well. Some of you may not, and that's why I'm asking that question, is because I want to make sure that, every one of us understands this worldview. It's an important worldview to understand. Okay. So atheism and humanism are connected. The book says that there's about 4% of population of the United States are atheists. I would say, yeah, it's probably true. The rest, people say that they're religious, but they don't live as religious people. They say they're religious, but they live like atheists. Let's put it that way. But that's okay. At least in their mind, they're something else. 13 to 16% of the world population are supposedly atheists. Maybe that's true. But one thing that the author says that ties all the atheists together is that they have a common worldview that claims a denial of the existence of God. The very idea, atheism means no God. That's what it means, no God. Well, if there isn't God or gods out there, then who is there? Well, one thing we know for sure, we're here, right? Therefore, if there isn't God, that means there's just people. And if it's just people, then it's basically all about us. So there you go. Humanism. It's a very logical progression. If there isn't God, then what is? Well, we are. Okay, that's it. If this is all that there is us. That makes sense. It's very logical. Now, terminology that I want you to know is a lot of people who embrace atheistic worldview call themselves agnostics, human secularists, or deists. Now, those are very not exactly the same things as atheists, by the way. These are other people who fall into this atheistic worldview, but they're not true atheists. Let's put it that way. Agnostic is somebody doesn't know, somebody who wonders. You know, it's a Greek word. Agnosis means I don't know. I have no knowledge. Basically, person can say, I don't think there's a God, but I don't know for sure. So I'm just going to assume that there isn't, and I'm going to live like there isn't, but I can't prove that there's one, and I can't prove there's another. So I'm just going to be a doubter for the rest of my life, and I'm just going to kind of try to wander through that way, but I don't know. So that's an agnostic. Agnostic is a person who doesn't want to accept one point as the absolute or another point as the absolute. And truly, if you really, 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 really push most atheists, they will admit to you that technically speaking, they're agnostics. They'll say there's no God, but then you say, all right, how do you know that? And they say, well, I just know it, or something like that. And you say, well, do you know everything that there is to know? Does your knowledge really have no limits? What if God is outside of the limits of your knowledge? And they'll say, well, yeah, I guess that's possible because my knowledge is limited. Well, I said, then you'll say something like, oh, yeah, well, then you don't know that there is no God. Well, that means you have to allow a possibility that there is. And they'll say, okay, you got it. I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. To be an atheist, I have to claim that I absolutely believe there is no God. Well, I can't claim that. Therefore, I'm an agnostic. I'm going to be a doubter, and that's it. So, and then there's human secularists that basically focus again on human experience, and they don't believe in God. They believe life is all about people. Even if they may even belong to a religious tradition. Some human secularists will say, they'll say, I am a Christian or something like that, or I am this or I'm that. But in the end, their philosophy is human secularism. That's their true worldview. They may be born into a particular religious tradition, but the way they live their life is as a human secularist, where God really doesn't play a role in our life. Just it's all about people. And then deists. Deist is a person who believes in God, believes in the existence of God, but they don't necessarily believe in a particular God or a particular personal God. So they say that there's something out there. There's some greater, stronger, greater power out there, but they don't know what that power is. And they certainly don't want to give it very particular and peculiar features. So they kind of have this general belief in the general existence of God, but no specific beliefs. This power did not give commandments. This power did not regulate morality. This power did not do this or that. This power does not really care whether you do this or you do that. So deists tend to be very generalistic as they approach the idea of God versus being very specific how a person of a particular religion would see that same exact question. So basically that's That's what they are. So you kind of have this notion among the atheists that religion is man-made. People made it up. And the solution to all problems is not found with God or religions. The solution to all problems for atheists is found through extending a scientific method of rational inquiry into all aspects of life. So it's not God, it's science that's going to solve everything in life. All the questions of life can be answered that way, not assuming that there is God. So the presupposition of a theist, there is no God, and that is irrelevant. Religion is something people made up, and it's irrelevant. And because this is a statement at the very bottom of page 106, it says, because atheists begin with the dismissal of God in their worldview, they have a strong belief in the individual. Atheists are individualists at the core. Most of them want to be self-reliant, independent, kind of governed, self-propelled, because if it's not about God, it's all about me. That means I make the rules. I decide what's good and bad. I decide what's right and wrong. And therefore, it's very self-focused, essentially. Now, atheists in a collectivistic society might think differently. They're in a collectivistic society, it's all about the social order. It's all about other people who are deciding things. But the tendency is to have a very strong focus on individual or on humanity in general. Okay? Do atheists have ethical standards? Well, yes, atheists say that they have ethical standards. However, most atheists would not be able to defend and articulate to you where those ethical standards come from and how do they choose. Because a true atheist, if they actually say there is no God, has no foundation for which to choose what's right and wrong. Because they themselves, by the definition of their own faith, would determine what is right and wrong. And therefore, their ethics would be very highly situational. Because what is right for me may be wrong for you, but it is right for me. So I would like to be the ruler of the world, and I would like to control everyone and tell everyone what to do. Well, that's bad for you, but that's good for me. You see what I mean? Well, is there such thing as good and bad then? And if you don't have some sort of a measure outside of yourself, which would be God for most people, telling you what's right and wrong, then you become the one who decides. And that essentially puts ethics into your hands. And so while most atheists will tell you that they have ethics and they are ethical people, most of them are good, moral, ethical people, they behave and do things well. Why? Because they simply follow the society standards. But in reality, they don't really have anything to base those ethics on. Like if you tell them, who decided that murder is wrong? Why? A true atheist wouldn't be able to answer that question. They'll say, well, people say it's wrong. But why? People say it's wrong. Where do the other people get this idea from? And the answer is that those people get that idea from religion. And but wait a minute, you deny religion. So they're caught in their own thinking, because you can't have it both ways, essentially. You can't have standards that come from outside of you and then not acknowledge that outside as being real. The death, of course, for atheists, it doesn't really have any spirituality, because there is no life after death. You're born, you die, you're gone. That's it. That's it. So what's life all about? It's about here and now. So why would I want to do something great to be remembered by people? Because life is about here and now. See what I mean? Things like that. Everything we do in life is now becomes a manifestation of our worldview. And you will see why people live a certain way or talk a certain way or do certain things. It's all based on who they are, what their worldview is, how they perceive themselves and the world around them. So that's atheism. Does that make sense? You guys have any questions? about atheists? You know some atheists who do not fit this picture, maybe?
Uh, I have friends in Brazil mostly. They born in a Christian family,
Uh-huh.
Muslim Catholic or Muslim Protestant, and they born and they raised in the church. And like when in the 20s age, they just, I'm tired of everything about God and church. I'm tired. God, this is nothing for me. Or I don't know. We can't call these people atheist because they know that God exists.
Sure.
Yeah, uh, because yeah, it's different because I know people they have a thesis that God really do not exist.
Right.
They really are atheist. It's just
Yeah. Like so Edison, the people who walk away from their faith and their culture, they're making a conscious move, in that direction. They're in rebellion, essentially, against their culture. But the
mhm,
truth is, that that culture shaped their mind already, and they can't undo it.
mhm,
They may engage in some behaviors right now that their culture, their family, their church would not approve of. And I'm going to tell you right now that no matter what they say, deep inside, they feel guilt and shame every time they do it. I guarantee you.
yeah,
They will work through it. They will still continue on because they're in a sense of rebellion against culture that they were brought up in. But they will never be able to get it out of their mind. They will still feel deep inside that uneasy feeling that they are transgressing a boundary that they shouldn't be transgressing. And they may be able to kind of keep it quiet, but it'll still bug them. It'll still bother them. It'll still be on their minds. They can't never really truly walk away from that, uh, because whether they like it or not, it is a part of their worldview. It's a part of the worldview they would like to change, and they're probably changing it slowly and gradually. But their formative years have, imprinted upon them a general morality. I find people who do not practice religion in a formal way are to be good, ethical, well behaving, productive members of society. It's not about being a practicing religious person per se. It's the fact that they come from a society that was religious and practicing that has put those values in them. So they continue living out those values without even realizing that they are. It's automatic. Culture is automatic. It's not like you don't think about it. I'm going to be a good person today. You just behave the way you've been taught to behave, and you're a good ethical person because your family taught you how to be that way. It's not that you have to think about it. And so when people walk away from a religious observance or what we can call a formal religion, right? They still continue to live in that pattern. There's a lot of people that I've met that have walked away from their religion, but they still live it, you know, even though they never come to pray anywhere. Let's put it that way. So yeah, you're right. And then there's other people who didn't grow up that way,
mhm,
and so their worldview is completely different because their values that they learned from their family was completely different, and they can also change. See, that's the thing. Somebody who grew up in a non-religious environment can come to a different understanding of the world gradually, and that will change their values. It will change their behavior, but they will also always struggle with those same formative things that were laid on them by whatever culture that influenced them initially. They will still have the same type of struggle. So we're very cultural creatures. Good point. Thank you, Edson. I appreciate that. Um, all right. So let's move a little bit into spirituality as a worldview. This may be an unusual for you. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. You guys, if you ever heard the term New Age, New Age, and I don't know if you see that in a positive light or negative light, I don't know. But New Age, worldview that in the United States is actually quite popular. There's a lot of people that would define themselves as followers of New Age. Well, they wouldn't do that consciously, and they wouldn't probably even use those words, but they are. Okay, that's who they are. So you'll meet those people. And so, what is this idea of spirituality as a worldview? Well, it's spirituality regarded as a system. This is on page 107. I'm reading top paragraph there in that section. Spirituality is regarded as a system that stresses that a person does not need formal religion to live a life of faith. You will hear this. People would say, I am not religious, I'm spiritual. And what they really mean is, I don't participate in a formal worship and a formal religion of any sort, but I am a kind of person who believes in God, who believes in gods, maybe. I believe in the spiritual world. I believe that there are things bigger than ourselves and that we need to connect to that, divine realm in some way, shape, or form. And so I'm sensitive to it. I'm aware of it. I'm interacting with it, but I'm not a part of some formal religious organization. I'm forging my own way. Why? Because if God is real and that reality is real, I should be able to connect to God and with God without other people telling me how to do it. Or I can grow in my own way of connecting. To whatever degree I'm ready, I will do it. And so you'll have these spiritual people who basically want to acknowledge the reality of God, but don't want to join a formal religion. Because a formal religion will put certain confines on them. It will give them a certain path, and they want to make their own path. They want to figure it out on their own. And so that's what this group of people falls into. So a very eclectic group, very diverse. There's really not one or two or three or five ways in which they embrace the world. Very, very different. Very different techniques, very different practices, very different paths. But they all have these kind of overarching ideas that they all agree on. And one of them is that the world is spiritual and they are spiritual, and that spiritual reality is real and they can connect to it, and they don't need anybody else to help them, basically. So they all embrace that idea. So the authors note that it is this idea of having a personalized worldview that appeals to the American value of individualism. Remember how we talked about Americans are individualists. It's about me, right? So this really works well for Americans. Americans love this because it tells me I can be a religious person or a spiritual person, but I don't need to be a part of any religious organization. I can be a religious organization all by myself, basically. And that really is appealing to a person who is a true individualist. I mean, it really works well for them. So the notion of a religion wherein people can turn to themselves to discover their inner peace combines this value of individualism with the value of free choice. Remember how we talk about, for Americans, free choice, freedom, doing what I want and having nobody being able to tell me what to do. How do Americans define freedom? Nobody can tell me what to do. I can do whatever I want. If I want to tattoo something on my forehead, I can tattoo something on my forehead. You may not like it, but I'm going to do it anyway. Why? Because I'm free. I can tattoo bad words across my forehead, and you have to look at those profane words every single day. But it's my freedom. It's my body, my choice. If that's what I want to do, that's what I'm going to do. And you're going to have to live with this, basically, and that's the American spirit, of being not confined to have limited choices, but to have that completely unrestrained ability to choose what to do. And so you could see how this type of religious experience would really appeal to a person who feels this way, who thinks this way, whose culture has trained them to have that value already. And so the emphasis is really important here. Okay, the distinction between religion and personal spirituality, okay, is the idea of emphasis of individual versus the institution. This is where this spirituality comes in. It's about individual spirituality versus corporate, structured, institutional spirituality. And that's why people want to have, sort of say, their own unique private religion, basically. And that's what we call spirituality. That's what we call New Age, or whatever, whatever term that you want to come up with. New Age is it's kind of a recent term that has been applied in this area, okay? So religion is typically experienced within an institution, a formal religion. Religion is an institutional creature, but spirituality is the part of each person, and how that person searches out the purpose, meaning, the worth of life. What is life all about? That's the quest for the ultimate value, for the ultimate, goodness and worth, sort of say, in life. And that's spirituality. So essentially these people tack onto that idea more than anything, and that kind of puts them in that frame of thinking. So again, you could see how somebody who embraces this worldview would be very different from a secularist, would be very different from a atheist, right? They may have some overlapping values, but for the most part, they embrace this idea of spirituality. So yes, for them, answers do lie with God or divine or something outside themselves. So they will not line up with, atheism on many issues. Maybe on some social issues, they'll be okay with them, but on many personal issues, they certainly would not. Okay. So this is good. There's a list of kind of values and guidelines that many of these people follow that you're welcome to read through. I'm not going to go through it because I think it's kind of self-evident. What's important to understand is that this spirituality worldview has the same goals that are found in most organized religions. Okay? Please don't misunderstand. This is people basically acting as their own religious institutions to themselves. The goals are exactly the same. They're just not willing to join some formal religion or some group. What do they seek? They seek inner peace. They want to link with nature. They want to find the meaning of life. They want to be good to others, and so these are all things that a formal religion would address, but they simply choosing to come to it themselves and in their own way. So that's spirituality as a worldview. Now, the third worldview, and after this, we're going to take a little break, guys. The third worldview is religion. We talked about atheism, we talked about spirituality, and now is religion. What is that as a worldview? Well, basically, what's important to understand is why religion is so key to study, so key to understand as we try to understand the world around us, is because religion affects the lives of billions and billions of people. Majority of people are religious, okay, in some way, shape, or form. They come from, if they're not actively religious, as in being participant in some religious tradition, they're influenced by it, okay? Just like Addison say, even if they walked away from the formal worship, their minds are still shaped by that culture, and whether they like it or not. So, and religion is important because it is an important part of life for so many people in this world. And that's why if you study religions in general, you will have a better understanding of people in general. Okay. It's not possible to study every religion out there. But if you devote yourself to the study of at least major religions of the world, then I think you will have a better understanding of majority of the people that you will encounter. And of course, you will encounter many people who don't fit into that, but at least you have a frame of mind to work from. Okay. So because religion is supplying the worldview for so many people, that's why it's important, and that's actually why we study religious experience and religious views in the study of communication. You think like, why in the world are we talking about this in communication? Because we already said, like, this is a major worldview, and the worldview shapes what you say and how you say it, or what you say and don't say. So your communicative behavior is directly influenced by your worldview, and religion is a major one. Let's see. Religions basically, I mean, the definition of religion is a little bit fuzzy. I'll be honest with you. It's kind of an artificial category. There are many people that have, many people who practice ancient religions that have been around for thousands of years do not define themselves as religions, and never have, until Romans came up with that word. Let's put it that way. And so what happens when your religion is thousands of years old and Romans have been around, slightly older than 2,000 years only? What did you call yourself for all the thousands of years before? Well, you didn't, because you didn't think of it that way. But essentially, the word religion is a Western word that people came up with for the purpose of classifying people, essentially. But it's not even entirely fair all the time. So, what is religion essentially is about? Well, it doesn't matter which religion we're talking about. Any religion can be understood as a people who have a outlook outside of themselves, and they seek help that is outside of themselves when they address the big questions in life. So those questions of the worldview that we asked, right, earlier, what is life all about? How did the world come to be? All those big questions that we talked about. It is the answers to those questions that people seek, and it is religion that provides answers to those questions. Questions, what is right and what is wrong, morality, the origins of the universe, all of that comes from your religion. Your religion tells you how those things are. And that is how religion can be defined. It is that tradition which answers those questions, basically. Okay? Whatever religion there may be, it usually answers those questions, at least in some cohesive way. Okay? And so why is this important? It's important because the deep structure of culture, as the authors say on page 110, deals with the issues that matter to most people. Remember, we talked about that a culture has a deep structure to it, and that deep structure does not change. There's certain parts of our culture that change, they're flexible, but there's certain parts of our culture that change, okay? They just stay very entrenched. And so religion is one of them. It is part of that deep culture. It tends to not change very much. It adapts, but not in the major way. And so many people look to life and everything they do, and they look to religion for explaining of what goes on around them. Their reality is interpreted through their religious understanding, and that's why studying religion is important. So it is religion is considered to be a mechanism by, like, sociologists and anthropologists. When they study religion, They understand religion as a mechanism of social control. Why? Because, because people they fall in line with what their religion tells them to do. So if you think of it as a social control. If a particular religious tradition believes that this is wrong, then everyone lives that way. And then people who are part of that culture fall in line. And so this is a form of controlling people in a social way to all sort of pull together in the same direction in whatever behavior that might be. Okay. It could be different things, but so the notions of right or wrong are, a part of this sort of say decision making that from the perspective of sociologists and anthropologists, that basically people relegate what is right and wrong to their religion. They don't need to sit around and think, is it right to do this? Is it wrong to do this? Their religion tells them it's right to do this, it's wrong to do that. They don't need to make that decision. That burden has been alleviated because their religious tradition has given them a clear direction on what to do and what not to do. Does that make sense? That's just how we are, and in that sense, if you look at it purely from a scientific point of view, if you're a scientist studying religion, that is how people understand it. And of course, that worldview, like any worldview, will have consequences, and consequences may be social, maybe political, maybe economic consequences. The way you vote in the elections can be driven by your religious worldview. In fact, for most people, it is. There are some people who cannot vote for a particular party because their religious view simply will not allow them, because their religious view tells them this is wrong. Well, this party has this platform. Well, guess what? I cannot support that platform. Why? Because I believe it's wrong. As a religious person, I can't go there. And therefore, you end up voting for the other party, things like that. So everything, or economic decisions, the same thing, or educational decisions, they're all driven by your worldview, and could be. And if your worldview is that religion, then it will drive you a certain way. Okay. Some religions basically emphasize education, others do not. Some religions emphasize only religious education and actually prohibit non-religious education. There are some. I have met people who have learned how to read and only read one book. That is their scriptures. Like whatever the scriptures of their religion is, that is the only book they own, and is the only book they read. They do not read anything else. I mean, they read things because they need to read things because they live life, mail comes, bill comes, billboards, whatever. There are things that you have to read. But as far as like picking up a book from a shelf, they don't read anything except their holy book. That is the only book. And that becomes their school book, essentially. They learn everything from it, and they even learn to read from it. That's their first book that they read, and that's it. So I've met people like that, and so they de-emphasize education that is outside of their religious worldview. That's it. It's just not valuable, so you stay out of it, and that's it. So yeah, it will affect every area of your life, including education, including your job choices, everything. Now, religion is undergoing some changes in the 21st century. We've already talked about it, how globalization is changing things around. One of the major changes that I want you to understand and know about is that never before in the history of our human history as a species we have had the ability to face each other in such an engaging way. Basically, the computers made it possible from people from various religious traditions to bump up against each other in a very significant way. Most conflicts in this world exist because of the worldview differences, okay? Most conflicts in this world exist because of religious differences, actually, because religion is the biggest worldview out there. And so we have not had this type of interaction. Short of one country trying to conquer another country, that's where the worldviews clash, okay? Where one civilization tries to imprint itself over on another, colonization, things like that, you know. But that is still limited. But what we have today is we're basically able to invade anyone's life in any society with our religious beliefs and our worldviews. Why? Because we're communicating over the internet and we're communicating instantly. There's YouTube videos, there's movies, there's this, there's that. We never had in the history of the world such an ability to influence each other or across massive borders in such a powerful, prolific way. The only way for me to influence a people, you know, in China, for example, 200 years ago, was to physically travel to China. You know, think about it. 200 years ago, if I wanted to change the mind of the Chinese in some way, I'd have to literally go to China and try to convince them to do something differently, right? Today, I don't have to do that. I have 1,000 other ways to influence them, you know. But before, that was my only avenue available to me. So globalization and technology is affecting religion because religions now face each other in a more prolific way that they have ever done before. There are many times religions never came in contact with other religions, or very little, okay? Only in some conflict, but they never came against each other in a peaceful environment. So they never held a dialogue. They never discussed anything. They just ignored each other or fought, you know, basically. Now we have this constant interaction between people of all sorts of religions. And because of the globalization and the migration of people, we have an infusion of people of various cultural backgrounds and religious backgrounds into pretty much every society. And so that changes religion. Globalization changes that aspect. There is an issue of violence in religion that's still an issue in our world today. Violence a lot of times happens simply because we want to force people to go our way. That's really the underlining point of violence. I want you to do what I want you to do, and you won't do it, so I'm going to force you to do it. Or you are trying to violate me in some way, and I'm fighting back. That's also violence. But the point is, religious violence is a reality. Oppression of people is a reality. Whether we're talking about a minority fighting against a majority or a majority trying to dominate a minority view, it's all about basically having your way or protecting your way from other people, forcing their way upon you. But that's religious violence. So that's an aspect of all world religions that has not gone, you know, away. Although there are religious traditions that tend to be much more amiable, much more pessimistic. They can go along with changes a lot easier. Like Hinduism, for example, can incorporate most spiritual thinking into their system because their system is so flexible. Let's put it that way. You can force a worldview on Hindus to a degree, and to a degree, they'll be able to incorporate it into their system of belief, and it will be okay. So they're flexible. Other religions are less flexible. They can't accept another worldview and assimilate it in. They'll have to fight it, you know, basically. So, so that's an important aspect. And so important understanding that we also have to have is that this textbook basically chooses only several religions to highlight, okay? And the reason why they chose several religions to highlight, they say that it has to do with numbers, diffusion, and relevance. And what that means is these are the most numeric religions. More people follow them, or their influence is really, their diffusion, their influence is very prolific, let's put it that way. Or they're relevant. You know, they're relevant to us because we come in contact with them more often than the others. And so they chose to focus only on several religions in this textbook because they cannot focus on all of them because there's simply too many of them. Let's put it that way. It's a huge area of study. So, but for the purpose of learning communication, you can focus just on a few religions, and that's, you know, that will still do. They'll still bring you into that understanding. All right. Let's take a little break over here. I stopped on page 113, and we'll continue reviewing this chapter. Like I said, we're gonna do a half a chapter this week and a half a chapter next week because it's a big one. Okay, so let's pause, let's break, and I will see you guys in okay. So it is 10:28, so 10 minutes from now. All right.